Welcome to Exposed and Broken YouTube channel. We uncover the secrets of love, betrayal, and the choices that change everything.
My life changed with a cotton swab and a plastic tube. 38 years of certainty gone in the time it took to read an email. DNA match, parent-child relationship, 99.9% James Harrington, not Robert Morgan. Not the man who taught me to ride a bike, who held my hand on my first day of school, who cried at my wedding. Not my dad, James Harrington, my mother's old friend from high school. The man who always remembered my birthday, who commented on my daughter's graduation photos, who seemed to appear at pivotal moments in my life, like a shadow I never thought to question. I remember the day the test arrived. My daughter Mia had given it to me as a birthday gift. "You're always talking about wanting to know more about our Scottish ancestors," she'd said excitedly. I noticed my mother's reaction immediately, a stiffening of her shoulders, the too casual dismissal. "Why would you waste money on that nonsense? We know our family history." My father, Robert, had laughed. "Let her have some fun, Caroline. What are you afraid of?" What was she afraid of? Now I knew. When the results came, my mother called within minutes. How did she know? Had she been waiting for this moment for 38 years, dreading the day her secret would surface? I didn't answer. Instead, I searched for James Harrington online. There he was, friend requests I'd accepted without thought, birthday wishes, comments telling me how proud he was of my accomplishments. A man I'd met perhaps a dozen times, always introduced as your mother's old friend. I remember him saying once, "You look just like your mother at your age. Same eyes." I'd thought nothing of it. When Robert came home that evening, he found me still staring at my computer screen. "Your mother called," he said. She sounded worried. "Dad," I said, the words suddenly feeling strange on my tongue. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth." His face changed. Something in his eyes. Resignation, perhaps. Relief. "You took one of those DNA tests, didn't you?" The question knocked the air from my lungs. "You knew? All this time, you knew?" He sat down heavily beside me. "I think I've always known. I just never wanted to be right." As we sat in silence, my phone buzzed with a text message. "I saw you took a DNA test. We should talk." James. How did he know? Who told him? My mother? Had they been in contact all these years? Was I the only one who didn't know who my father really was? I looked up at the man who had raised me, who had been there for every important moment of my life. His eyes were filled with tears, but there was also something else, the weight of a 38-year secret finally lifting from his shoulders. "What happens now?" I asked. "That's up to you." "Sweetheart, it always has been." That's how my story begins, not with my birth, but with the death of everything I thought I knew about myself. My name is Eliza Morgan. At least, I think it is. And this is the story of how I discovered the truth about my family, my identity, and the lies that bound us together for nearly 4 decades. I called my sister Sophie that night. My hands trembled as I dialed, wondering if her world was about to shatter too. "Hey, what's up?" Her voice was light, normal. The voice of someone whose identity wasn't crumbling beneath her feet. "I got my DNA results back," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Oh, cool. Are we Scottish royalty?" She laughed. "Sophie, Dad isn't my biological father." The silence that followed felt endless. "What are you talking about?" she finally whispered. "The test matched me with someone named James Harrington, Mum's friend from high school, the one who's always commenting on our Facebook posts." "That's impossible," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "There must be some mistake. I just talked to Dad. He's known, or at least suspected, all along." Another silence. "I'm coming over," she said, and hung up. Sophie arrived with a bottle of wine and eyes rimmed red. She'd already been crying. We sat at my kitchen table, the same table where we'd shared countless family dinners, holiday gatherings, birthday celebrations. All those memories now tinged with something false. "What did Dad say exactly?" she asked, pouring us each a generous glass. I recounted our conversation. how he'd seemed almost relieved that the truth was finally out. "I'm going to take the test too," Sophie said, her voice firm. "I need to know." "Dad thinks you're his," I said. "Biologically, I mean. I need to be sure." She took a long sip of wine. "What are you going to do about Mom?" What was I going to do? The woman who raised me, who I thought I knew better than anyone, had been living a lie my entire life. Had been looking me in the eyes for 38 years, knowing that the man I called Dad wasn't my biological father. "I'm going to confront her," I said. "Tomorrow. Will you come with me?" Sophie nodded, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. "Of course, we're in this together." That night, I barely slept. I scrolled through old family photos, studying my features, comparing them to Robert's, searching for similarities I'd always taken for granted. Had I been blind, or just unwilling to see? The shape of my eyes, the curve of my jaw, they weren't his. They never had been. I found photos of James Harrington too, from various family events over the years, always in the background, always watching. In one Christmas party picture from when I was about 10, I noticed something I'd never seen before, the way he was looking at me while everyone else faced the camera. The longing in his eyes was unmistakable. Morning came too quickly. Sophie arrived early, her face pale but determined. We drove to our mother's house in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. Caroline Morgan had lived alone since her divorce from Robert 15 years ago. Their separation had been amicable. At least that's what they'd told us. Now I wondered if this secret had been the real reason. She opened the door with a smile that faltered when she saw our expressions. "Girls, what's wrong?" "We need to talk, Mom," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. Her eyes darted between us, then she stepped aside to let us in. Her living room was immaculate as always, family photos arranged perfectly on the mantel. I stared at one of me as a baby in her arms, Robert beaming beside them. "Is this about that DNA test?" she asked, sitting primly on the edge of her armchair. "Because those things aren't always accurate, you know. It's accurate enough to tell me that Robert Morgan isn't my biological father," I said, "and that James Harrington is." The color drained from her face. For a moment, I thought she might deny it, might try to maintain the lie she'd lived for so long. Instead, her shoulders slumped. "How did you find out about James?" she asked quietly. "The test matched us as parent and child, 99.9% certainty." I leaned forward. "How could you, Mum? How could you lie to me my entire life?" "I didn't lie," she said, her voice taking on a defensive edge. "Robert is your father in every way that matters." "Except biologically," Sophie interjected. "Were you having an affair?" Caroline flinched at the word. "It wasn't like that. It was complicated." "And explain it," I demanded. "Make me understand how you could do this." She took a deep breath, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. "James and I dated in high school. He was my first love, but his family moved away our senior year, and we tried to make it work long distance, but..." She shook her head. "I met your father in college. He was kind and stable, and everything James wasn't. We got married right after graduation. And then what?" I pressed when she fell silent. "James came back to town about a year into our marriage. He'd never stopped loving me," he said. Her eyes took on a faraway look. "I was young and stupid and confused. It was just one night. One night that resulted in me," I said bitterly. She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "When I found out I was pregnant, I prayed the baby was Robert's. We'd been together around the same time. But when you were born..." She trailed off. "You knew." I finished for her. "You took one look at me and knew. You had James's eyes," she whispered. "His exact eyes." "And Dad, when did he figure it out?" "I never told him outright, but I think he suspected from the beginning. He never said anything, just loved you like his own." "And James, did he know?" Caroline nodded slowly. "He guessed. When you were about 2, he saw you at the grocery store with me. He took one look at you and just knew. He confronted me later. So he's known I was his daughter my entire life." The betrayal cut deeper than I'd imagined possible. And you both decided to keep me in the dark? It was my decision, Caroline said quickly. James wanted to be part of your life, but I couldn't risk my marriage, our family. I made him promise to keep his distance. Some promise, Sophie scoffed. He's been hovering around the edges of Eliza's life for years. Those weren't coincidences, were they? All those times he showed up at graduations, birthdays? I couldn't keep him away completely, Caroline admitted. He loved you, Eliza. He still does. I stood up abruptly, needing space, air, distance from the woman who had orchestrated this elaborate deception. My whole life has been a lie, I said, my voice breaking. No, sweetheart. Caroline reached for my hand, but I pulled away. Your life has been real. Your family has been real. Robert is your father in every way that matters. Except you denied me the right to know the truth. Both of you did. I turned to Sophie. I need to go. Eliza, please, my mother pleaded. Try to understand. I was protecting our family. You were protecting yourself, I corrected her. And now I have to tell my daughter that the man she thinks is her grandfather isn't related to her at all. Do you have to tell her? Caroline asked, her voice small. I stared at her in disbelief. Sophie and I left, my mother's tears following us out the door. In the car, Sophie reached over and squeezed my hand. What now? She asked. Now I talk to James, I said. I need to hear his side of the story. James Harrington lived in a modest house on the other side of town. I'd driven past it countless times without giving it a second thought. Now I sat in my car outside, gathering the courage to knock on the door of the man who had contributed half my DNA, but remained a stranger. Do you want me to come with you? Sophie had offered. But I shook my head. This is something I need to do alone. His door opened before I could knock. He must have been watching for me. Eliza, he said, my name catching in his throat. Thank you for coming. Up close, the resemblance was undeniable. The same eyes that looked back at me from the mirror every morning. The same slight dimple in the left cheek when he smiled nervously. May I come in? I asked formally, as if this were a business meeting and not a collision of worlds. His living room was cluttered but warm. Books everywhere, a piano in the corner. And photos. So many photos. Of me. Me at my high school graduation, taken from a distance. Me on my wedding day. A newspaper clipping. My daughter Mia's birth announcement from the local paper. A lifetime of moments he had collected from afar. This is unsettling, I said, gesturing to the shrine of my life. He flushed, embarrassed. I'm sorry. I know it must seem strange, but these were all I had. Why didn't you tell me? I asked. The question that had been burning inside me since I'd seen those test results. He sank into an armchair, suddenly looking every one of his 64 years. I wanted to. God, Eliza, I wanted to every single day. His voice was thick with emotion. But your mother made me promise. She said it would destroy your family, hurt you and Robert, and I'd already caused enough pain. So instead you lurked in the background of my life, watched from a distance. That was your solution? It was the only way I could be near you. He leaned forward, his eyes, my eyes, pleading for understanding. I know it wasn't fair to you, but I convinced myself it was better than nothing. Did you love her? My mother? Yes, he said without hesitation. Caroline was the love of my life. When I came back to town and found her married, he shook his head. I should have respected that, but I was young and selfish and thought love conquered all. One night, I said. That's what she told me. One night that changed everything, he agreed. When she told me she was pregnant, I wanted her to leave Robert, to be with me, but she refused, said she'd made vows, made a commitment. So you just gave up? Walked away from your child? I didn't walk away, he said, a flash of anger in his voice. I stayed as close as she would allow. I sent birthday cards, Christmas presents. When you were little, I'd sometimes bring gifts when Robert was at work. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. You were in my house when I was a child? He nodded. Just a few times. Your mother would let me visit, just to see you. You were so small, so perfect, you wouldn't remember. But suddenly I did remember fragments of memory. A tall man with kind eyes bringing a stuffed bear. My mother's tense smile. Being told he was Mommy's friend. This is too much, I said, standing up. I need time to process all this. Of course, he said quickly, rising too. Take all the time you need. But Eliza, he hesitated. I want you to know that I've loved you your entire life. From a distance, yes, but with my whole heart. I looked at him, this stranger who was my father, and felt nothing but confusion. No rush of connection, no sense of belonging. Just questions and anger and grief. I have a daughter, I said. Mia, she's 19, your granddaughter. His eyes filled with tears. I know, I've seen her pictures. She looks like you. She deserves to know the truth about all of this. He nodded. Whatever you decide to tell her, I'll support. And if someday you both wanted to get to know me. He left the sentence hanging, a question mark in the air between us. I couldn't give him an answer, not yet. I left his house with more questions than I'd arrived with. My emotions a tangled mess I couldn't begin to unravel. At least one like for our character, she deserves it, and subscribe for her life story. Telling Mia was both easier and harder than I'd imagined. We sat in her dorm room, surrounded by the trappings of her college life. Textbooks, photos of friends, the stuffed elephant she'd had since childhood. A gift from Robert, my dad, the only grandfather she'd ever known. So let me get this straight, she said after I'd explained everything. Grandpa isn't actually your biological father. This James guy is. I nodded, watching her face carefully for signs of distress. And no one thought to mention this for, 38 years. That's about the size of it, I said. To my surprise, she laughed, a short, incredulous burst. That is so messed up. You're not upset. I mean, it's weird for sure, but Grandpa is still Grandpa, right? He's still the man who taught me to fish and helped me with my science projects and sends me care packages every month. Her simple acceptance brought tears to my eyes. Yes, he's still all those things. Then the rest is just biology, she shrugged. Though I am curious about this James person. My other grandfather, I guess. He wants to meet you, someday, if you're interested. She considered this. Maybe, not right away, but someday I'd like to meet him. I hugged her tight, marveling at her resilience, her uncomplicated view of family. What about Grandma? She asked. Are you still mad at her? Was I? The anger was still there, simmering beneath the surface. The sense of betrayal hadn't diminished. I'm working through it, I said honestly. It's complicated. Adults always say that when they don't want to admit they're being stubborn, she commented wryly. She said with the wisdom of youth. Just saying. I laughed despite myself. When did you get so smart? Must be those good genes, she said with a wink. The weeks that followed were a slow process of rebuilding. Sophie's DNA test confirmed what we'd suspected. She was indeed Robert's biological daughter. The relief on her face was palpable, followed immediately by guilt. I'm sorry, she said. That's not fair to you. It's okay, I assured her. I'm glad one of us isn't dealing with an identity crisis. Robert, Dad, was my rock through it all. Our relationship, if anything, grew stronger. Without the weight of the secret between us, he seemed lighter, more open. I need you to know something, he told me one evening as we sat on his porch swing. I never for 1 second thought of you as anything but my daughter. From the moment the doctor placed you in my arms, you were mine. Why didn't you ever confront Mom? I asked. About James? He sighed, looking out at the darkening sky. At first, I was afraid of losing her. Later, I was afraid of losing you. I thought if the truth came out, everything would fall apart. But you stayed, even after you and Mom divorced. Of course I stayed. You're my daughter. He said it simply, as if there could never have been any other choice. I'm going to see James again tomorrow, I told him. He wants to show me some old photos, tell me about his side of the family, medical history, that kind of thing. I watched his face carefully, looking for signs of hurt or jealousy. There were none. That's good, he said. You deserve to know where you come from. He hesitated. Would you like me to come with you? The offer stunned me. You'd do that? If it would help you, yes. I leaned my head against his shoulder, overwhelmed by his generosity of spirit. I love you, Dad. I love you too, sweetheart. Always have, always will. My relationship with my mother was slower to heal. The anger and sense of betrayal ran deep, but gradually, as I came to understand more about her choices, the fear, the social pressures of the time, the genuine love she felt for both men, I found room for forgiveness. I was wrong to keep the truth from you, she admitted during one of our cautious coffee dates. I thought I was protecting you, but I was really protecting myself. From what? From losing you, she said simply. I was terrified that if you knew about James, you'd hate me, that you'd choose him over me and Robert. I wouldn't have, I said, but I deserved the chance to make that choice for myself. She nodded, tears in her eyes. I know that now. I'm so sorry, Eliza. It wasn't an instant reconciliation. Trust, once broken, takes time to rebuild, but it was a start. James and I developed a tentative relationship, not father-daughter in the traditional sense. That role would always belong to Robert, but something unique to us. He shared stories of his family, showed me photos of grandparents I'd never known I had, filled in pieces of my genetic puzzle. Your grandmother could sing like an angel, he told me once, just like you. These small connections, these threads of shared DNA, helped me understand myself in new ways. The musical ability that had always seemed to come from nowhere. The left-handedness that made me unique in my family. The allergies that plagued me each spring. 6 months after the DNA test that changed everything, we gathered for Mia's 20th birthday. All of us, Robert, Caroline, James, Sophie, me. An unconventional family by any standard, but family nonetheless. There was awkwardness, of course, moments of tension. But there was also laughter, genuine warmth, and the beginning of something new. As I watched Robert and James talking amicably by the grill, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't expected to find. My family hadn't been destroyed by the truth. It had expanded, grown more complex, more honest. Mia sidled up beside me, following my gaze. Weird to see your two dads together, huh? She smiled. I smiled. A little, but good weird. So which one is walking you down the aisle next month? She asked. I'd recently gotten engaged, a bright spot in the tumultuous year. Both of them. I said, if they're willing. She nodded approvingly. I like that. Very modern. Later that evening, as the party wound down, I found myself alone with James on the patio. The questions that had been swirling in my mind for months finally found voice. Do you regret it? I asked. The affair with Mom. He considered the question carefully. I regret the pain it caused, the deception. But I could never regret you, Eliza. You're the best thing I've ever been part of creating. Even though you couldn't be my father? Not really. I've learned that being a father isn't just about biology, he said. Robert taught me that. He's a better man than I ever gave him credit for. He is, I agreed. But I'm glad to know you too, to understand where I came from. James smiled, and I saw myself in that smile. I'm glad too. More than you can know. My wedding day dawned clear and bright. As I prepared to walk down the aisle, Robert and James waited outside the bridal room, both handsome in their tuxedos, both nervous in their own ways. Ready? Robert asked when I emerged. As I'll ever be, I replied, taking his arm. James stood awkwardly to the side until I reached for him too. Both of you, I said. Please. The three of us made an unusual procession, the bride and her two fathers. But as we walked down the aisle, Mia beaming from her place as my maid of honor, I felt only gratitude. Gratitude for the man who had raised me, loved me, been my father in every way that mattered. Gratitude for the man whose DNA I carried, who had watched over me from afar, loving me in the only way he was allowed. And gratitude for the truth, painful as it had been. Because living honestly, I'd discovered, was infinitely better than living in the shadow of a lie. The secrets and lies of infidelity had rippled through generations of my family, causing pain and confusion decades after that one fateful night. But in confronting those secrets, in bringing them into the light, we'd found a way forward. Not perfect, not without scars, but real, authentic. As I reached the altar and placed a kiss on each father's cheek before they stepped aside, I knew that this is complicated, messy, beautiful truth was the greatest gift I could pass on to my own children someday. Not a fairy tale of perfect families and flawless parents, but the honest story of human beings who make mistakes, who hurt each other, but who also love fiercely and find the courage to begin again. That is my legacy now, and it's enough. #the end. Thank you for watching Exposed and Broken. I have been broken by infidelity in my life. Support me to buy a house by watching Exposed and Broken. Please like and subscribe.